Stat correlations. We do it every year. Let's check in on it and refresh our memories of what is stable and what isn't. Michael Bolton, you seem really stable.
Thanks, Josh. It's Michael Bolton here, and it's time for another episode of the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Podcast. Let's get to it.
Let's get to it, indeed.
You are Locked On Fantasy, your daily NBA fantasy podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Podcast, brought to you by Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd, and I just remember Gwyneth Paltrow had a song that was like the top of the charts? Gwyneth Paltrow, she had a song. Why? Who cares? Anyway, I'm also the lead fantasy analyst at basketballmonster.com, and you can find me on Twitter as always, at redrock_bball, on TikTok at redrock_bball, and on Instagram at Locked On Fantasy Basketball. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Make every moment more. All through the summer, you know what happens. The sports are at a minimum. It's reduced. But FanDuel's got it for you. Every day, there's a bonus or a boost for every customer. Go to FanDuel.com to learn more. Thank you also for making Locked On Fantasy Basketball your first listen every day. We are free. We're available on all platforms. Double bang. Hit the thumb. And one important thing you can do is wish me luck. I've got to jump into an online queue to buy Travis Scott tickets for my son. So I hope I get him. I'm sure he hopes I get him as well. Fingers crossed. Like I said, I'm away for a few days, so this is being recorded in advance. So we do this show every year. It's important. We reference it back all the time. And we check whether any of the data has changed. We check on how these things work. And we're looking at categories. And we're looking at how stable or how predictable year-on-year production is. What we do is a look at the top about 250 to 270 players. Obviously take into consideration rookies are removed from that pool because they didn't play the year before, and just try and have a look at what level of production from one year correlates across to the next year. The standard categories plus usage, 3-point percentage, minutes per game, and the big one, games played. So we'll revisit it. Let's have a look now, and let's see if there's anything that's majorly different, and also just refreshing our memory on the things that are stable, consistent, and the things that aren't, and how we can pay attention to that for fantasy. So let's take a look. I love doing this show every year. I love preparing for this show every year because, again, we always have our narratives. I like to break narratives. I like to confirm narratives, but I like to update narratives as well. The narrative that I've always had that interest in is a few of them. There's always revenge games, contract years, and injury history. And in the past, every time that I've done this, we've seen that games played has been non-correlated with the games before. Very low correlation, low consistency of games played per season. And we're going to find out whether that's the case here. We're also going to find out the other stats and how we can sort of base our drafting strategy on what can carry over and what doesn't carry over. Let's start on the stable stuff. Let's start on the easy ones. Which categories do correlate really highly? So we're using the Pearson coefficient for correlation. If you don't know what that is, it's very easy. Google. It's just basically looking at the way that on the y-axis, you've got 1 year. On the x-axis, you've got the other year. A perfect 1 on it as a Pearson coefficient means that it's an exact 45-degree straight line. That whatever number you get in 1 year is exactly the same as the number you get in the next year. That's what a 1 means. If you go down to a -1, well, it's the opposite direction. It means that you're talking about a negative correlation. You're talking about an inverse relationship between the two variables. And the other one is that we are talking, if you've got a 0 right in the middle, there is just no correlation whatsoever. Where things are random, they're haphazard, and we can't make any sense of it. So as you can see on the screen, we've got 6 categories there. It's actually a 7th, which is on the next page. We'll get to that in a second, which are highly correlated. Points, assists, rebounds, blocks, 3-pointers made, and usage. All of those have got Pearson coefficients of at least 0.860. And the lowest one there is blocks at that 0.860. So the other thing you can look at is the R squared, which gives you an idea of what percentage of variance is apportioned to the previous year's numbers. So for example, when we look at those blocks, who's got an R of 0.860, again, still a really strong correlation. The R squared is 0.739, meaning 74% approximately of blocks numbers are to do with the way that the player has performed in that category in the year prior. And then there's about roughly 25% is due to external factors. And all of these other ones here have at least an R squared of higher than 0.74 because we can see how high their correlation is. Scoring, assists, rebounds, blocks, threes, usage. As a general, we know there are going to be outliers. It's going to happen. Someone's going to pop off and have a big jump up in scoring. Someone's going to have a big change in their block numbers. Someone is going to hit more threes than before or way fewer threes. That happens. But as a general rule, points, assists, rebounds, blocks, threes, usage are all really highly correlated with really high consistency of outcomes year on year. And it was exactly the same with these categories in previous seasons. This is an ongoing trend. We've looked at it year on year for about 4 years now. We've looked at it year on year versus the 3 years prior, and it is all basically the same. Points, assists, and rebounds, and that's, again, you know that I talk about this a lot. High volume categories with high level consistency are things that I like to focus more on in terms of drafts. Low volume categories, and especially low volume categories with low consistency, are the ones that can be really iffy. Now, blocks is the interesting one because it's a low volume category, and same as threes. Blocks and threes are low volume categories, but there is a level of consistency. Compare and contrast that to steals or free throw percentage, which you'll find are absent from this list. They are low percentage or low volume categories, but they don't have high correlation. So when we're talking about looking at the value of a player year on year, we want to look to the ones to determine how safe is this guy. We want to look to these categories as our first sort of step. Points, rebounds, assists, blocks, threes. The other one on this list is, I'll bring it up now on the screen, it is turnovers. That is relatively highly correlated as well. 0.859. You'll always have the outlier. Someone like Darius Garland had some weird numbers this season in terms of his turnovers increasing. But as a general rule, turnovers, points, usage, rebounds, assists, blocks, and threes, they are relatively highly correlated year on year. This has been a consistent trend over 3 to 4 seasons. So I feel really good about continuing to say that and sticking with that idea and that narrative. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. The summer means less sports, just a simple fact. But that doesn't mean there aren't things going on. Major League Baseball, WNBA, the Olympics is on. The Olympics, it's on at the moment. And FanDuel's giving you a helping hand because they know that your usual volume of sports, your usual cornucopia is not there. So they're going to give every customer, either a bonus or a boost every day, all summer long. Every customer, every day, all summer. What a great deal. FanDuel is where you want to go. So go to FanDuel.com to get started and start making the most of your summer. FanDuel is an official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. And don't forget to gamble responsibly. So, good news. I got the Travis Scott tickets. So your positivity and your thoughts and your will got us there. We did it. W to us. Don't forget, check out Locked On Sports today across on YouTube, live 24/7 show that actually just gets to the basis of what sport is, not the nonsense talking points that you see on your TV of people yelling at each other. We don't want that, do we? No, absolutely not. So let's talk more correlations now because we went through the high ones. They were really easy. Let's talk about some stats with some moderate consistency. So there's a level of predictability, but not a great level of predictability. And there are a couple in this group here who do have some sizable changes from where it sat last year. So let's just talk about that right now. Minutes are, they're very close to being a highly correlated stat. The R coefficient comes out at 0.801. You'll remember all of the high ones were at least 0.86. 0.801 is not it's not a terribly low number by any stretch. It's fine. It's just not quite as high as those other ones were. And if we're talking about the R squared number for minutes, it's 0.641, meaning 36% of the minutes variance is not necessarily explained by the minutes from the previous year. That we sort of understand that the minutes are going to be relatively consistent, but there's going to be changes. Players drop off, players step up, improvements in guys, different situations. This all makes sense. We can look at minutes from the year before to give us some sort of a baseline. It's an okay starting point, but there is going to be decent enough changes that have to be explained through context and nuance and all that sort of thing. That's a pretty obvious thing. You know one thing, many things. I'm sure there's many things that you hear me say all the time, and one of them is steals. Steals are an incredibly variable stat. They're low volume, which is in essence always annoying because you might average 1.1 steal or 0.8 steals. You cannot get 0.8 steals. You cannot get 1.2. You can get 0, 1, or 2. 2 is amazing. 1 is average. 0 is nothing. All right, so weeks and games can be skewed by someone getting 5 and then they get none for the next 10 games, but their average comes out the same as someone who gets 1 a game, or, roughly. And the other problem with steals is that year to year, they just change a lot. And this season, it was actually worse than it has been in the past. And again, numbers are not the be-all and end-all. For anyone who presents numbers, or if anyone pushes back on numbers, often their excuse about is, well, just watch the game, you nerd. Get out of your spreadsheet, bloody nerds. Gonna give you a wedgie. But nobody who actually takes numbers seriously does anything without any context. Because I can look at this and go, oh, it's actually getting worse for steals. Less consistency. But I've got reasons for it. And one of the major reasons, and we saw this all through the start of last season, is that for some reason, the NBA started counting those swipe downs as a player was beginning to take a shot as blocks instead of steals. So we saw so many guards, CJ McCollum, Fred VanVleet, for example, 2 names that come to mind. I think Jalen Green was one of them as well. We saw their block numbers go up and their steal numbers come down. And then the second half of the season, the block numbers restabilized and the steal numbers sort of went back to where they were before. That's one explanation. The other part of it is steals are just inherently variable. The R number, the Pearson coefficient for steals this season compared to 22-23, it was 0.684. That is not particularly highly correlated, as you can see when you're comparing it to the other numbers. The R squared is 0.468, meaning over 50% of the variance in steals year to year cannot be explained by what happened the year before. That's a lot. Last year, steals were a very low or a moderate consistency, low to moderate consistency number, but their Pearson coefficient was 0.763. So it was actually higher than what it was this season. More variability into the steals. So, again, remember, steals also have an outsized impact on traditional ranking systems for fantasy, but also now understand that when you look at a player's ranking, check how much of an impact either a big increase in steals was or a big decrease in steals was, because that could easily flip back the other way the next season. This, again, is not to say that a high steals player becomes a bad steals player. They might just go from a 2 steals player to a 1.4 steals player. It's a big difference when we're talking about decimal numbers. Field goal percentage is also considered moderate in terms of consistency. It's similar to minutes. Its Pearson is 0.798. So we're not talking the level of consistency problems that you have with steals, but we've got an R squared of 0.637, meaning over 35% of the variance is not explained by previous years. Role, shot selection, shot attempts, team you're playing on, defense that comes your way. This is not to say even whether everyone's number goes up or goes down, or just look how does it join in. In field goal percentage has some variance. So does 3-point percentage, but to a much more variable degree. I think you've probably heard the number in the past is that I think we'd need like 700 3-point attempts before we get real stabilization on someone's shooting ability. And if we look at it here, the 3-point R number is 0.552, the lowest number that we have encountered so far. Interestingly, that gives a R squared of 0.304, meaning 70% of the variance in 3-point shooting numbers is not based on the previous year's shooting. It's a lot of other factors, meaning it is a relatively highly variable statistic, 3-point percentage. Now, what you did notice is that 3-pointers made stays relatively stable, meaning that often the volume changes can offset the shooting percentages, but what does then happen is that the three-point shooting percentage impacts overall field goal percentage. So maybe that's the reason that field goal percentage can be less reliable. Last season, three-point percentage had an R value of 0.338, so it was way less variable. It became a little bit more stable this season. But overall, we're talking about a low to moderate level of consistency when we're talking about a player's three-point shooting year on year. We see it all the time. How often does someone, even a good shooter, like Grayson Allen, shot 46%? He's a great shooter, but was he the year before, 40? Guys who were 42% guys become 36% guys. It's a big difference. A player, Scotty Barnes, who was a 28% shooter, becomes a 34% shooter. These are giant jump ups when we're talking about such a small range of overall shooting percentages. Evan Mobley jumped up 16 percentage points in his three-point shooting this season. So field goals and threes, relatively variable. Moderate variability. Minutes and steals, moderate variability, with steals and threes being closer to the low side of reliability and consistency when we're talking about year-to-year numbers. And that leaves us with the categories that we look at as the low variance. Well, sorry, the low consistency, the low correlation, the high variance. We've talked about this quite a bit in the past. So let's just talk about it now. Games played. Games played has consistently been a low consistency stat. Now, I know that sounds confusing, but every year when I do this, games played comes out as the stat with one of the lowest, if not the lowest, R and R squared number. Now, I am always going to be honest with the findings that we have. My narrative, it's not narrative, it's based on numbers, has always been it is almost impossible to predict games played year on year. We have issues with players with degenerative, lower body, recurrent injuries where we do take that into consideration, Kawhi Leonard, Joel Embiid, even though Kawhi played a lot of games this year. But things like a torn hamstring, a broken hand, a concussion, a back injury, a sprained ankle, they don't carry over. Every single year, you relying upon that as the basis of how you plan your fantasy draft. I know it can be scary. Oh, how could I draft this guy? He played 40 games. I know it can be scary. But the numbers consistently show the same thing. That this is the lowest year-on-year correlation of any of the categories we track. So, but again, I will say this, is that this season, the number jumped up. In the past, the R, the Pearson coefficient, had always been under 0.3. It was 0.283 last season. This season, it jumped up to 0.424. That is a sizable jump. That still does not mean that it is particularly reliable. It means its R squared is 0.18, meaning 82% of the year-on-year variance has nothing to do with the games played in the previous season. Last year, the R squared was, I think, 0.8, meaning that 92% of the variance was irrespective of the games played the prior year. So we did actually get a year where games played year on year had more relevance. It's still not highly relevant. It's still very low relevance and not something we should pay that much attention to. Because again, I remember May last year doing a draft of the top dynasty prospects from the past 3 years in the draft and had Chet Holmgren at like 3 or something. And that was almost one of the number one things that people push back on is you can't have Chet that high. He missed his entire rookie season. He's never going to be healthy. Well, bro played 82 games this season. 82. Couldn't have played more. Zion Williamson. Yes, he did miss games in the playoffs. Played a ton of games. Anthony Davis. LeBron James. Porzingis played more games last year, fewer this year. LaMelo Ball had 2 years in a row of really low games played. He played 75 the year before that. These numbers, and this is not me trying to gaslight anyone to tell you that injuries don't matter, because we know they do. But this is year on year on year on year of telling you that the games played year versus year just do not correlate as a general rule to what happened the year before. I can't, again, the way that statistics work is this does not mean that this is the case for everybody. There will be players who play low games and it stays low. There are players who play low games and then they play a lot of games. There are players that play a lot of games and they play a lot of games. There are players that play a lot of games and play no games. And there's always an outlier until there's not. Mikal Bridges has never missed a game. Tell you what, he will. Don't know when. Hope he doesn't. Hope no one ever misses time. But he will. I can just keep listing guys who never used to get hurt. Karl Anthony Towns, Russell Westbrook, Damian Lillard. And now the thing is, well, you can't draft Towns. He's always hurt. Right? It changes all the time. Bradley Beal, I think, played 82 games in a row, 82 games 3 years in a row. Brook Lopez did it for 2 or 3 years in a row. This stuff changes consistently. Always. Always. The other one is free throws, which we had a weird season for free throws. Last season, the Pearson coefficient for free throws was 0.7. That's moderate correlation. That's not bad. It's okay. This season, 0.367. Free throws were basically unpredictable. That's low. That is the lowest number of anything we had. And I just didn't expect that to be the finding. Because it hasn't been the finding in the past. Free throws R squared was 0.135. Just completely all over the place in terms of numbers. If I look at free throws from the 22-23 season and how they correlated to past years, like I said, it was 0.7, which was a 0.49 R squared. And if we look at free throws compared to the 3 years prior, it was actually down at 0.476. So was the consistency we got last year the outlier? The fact that we've got inconsistencies means that it's really hard to rely upon free throw percentage as a number that we can just, fully bank on is going to be the bang-on thing every single year. We have good free throw guys. We have bad free throw guys. Sometimes the bad guys become less bad or more bad, and the good guys become 92 guys instead of 85 guys. But it's not all about, did you move... Like, we always know that average is, let's say 79, 80. 80 is average for free throws. Consistency doesn't mean did you go from below 80 to above 80 or above or below, or did you just stay above 80 or did you stay below 80? Like if someone's a 77 shooter and becomes a 71 shooter, does that not matter because they're both below average? Or if you're a 91 guy and you become an 85 guy, it doesn't matter because you're still good? No. That's not how it works, because when we talk about the valuation and the way that it impacts your overall team, it has an impact. And that's where we sit with free throws. This season, free throw percentage was the most variable category that we had. As a general rule, we usually have free throws, steals, games played as the bottom. That's again what we had, even though steals were a little bit higher this season. So we did... Actually, no, sorry. Steals were a little bit lower this season. Percentages come in next. And then we've got the stable guys. The PRA. Points, rebounds, assists, blocks, usage, turnovers, three-pointers made. Keeping a relatively same shape. Again, most of you would have seen this data in previous years. The general idea of it, there were some interesting changes with the drop in free throw percentage, the improvement in games played. Some changes, absolutely. But it's a good idea, I think, just to get that back into your head when assessing how do I view a player from the year before? How do I take his numbers and what do I look at as we move forward? How do we progress that out into dynasty leagues? I think there's a lot to take out of it, and the more you hear that, the more you'll burn it in, and the more we'll do this every year to see where the patterns emerge. And that's the end of the show. Not a long one, that's what she said, but get that information out there. All right. I want you to go ahead and hit the thumb and the bang and the comment, subscribe, tell your friends. The numbers are there. They do not lie. I mean, you can try to make them lie, but I don't. There's no point in it because we're just trying to get accurate information. Guys, we are done here. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya.